It's Monday, August 24th, 2026. 14 bombs, 30,000 pounds each. That's the entire American arsenal of massive ordnance penetrators that existed in any meaningful operational quantity, and every single one of them got dropped in a single night on 3 Iranian nuclear sites, in what remains the largest B-2 stealth bomber mission ever flown in the history of American air power. Let's talk about how the United States actually pulled off Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike that hit Iran's deepest uranium enrichment facility. Because the mission itself is honestly one of the most remarkable feats of modern military logistics you'll ever hear broken down in detail. And what happened afterward turned into one of the most contested intelligence disputes of the entire war. Let's talk about the target itself first, because you can't understand why this mission required such an extraordinary amount of planning without understanding exactly what Fordo actually is and why it was considered so uniquely difficult to reach. Buried into the side of a mountain near the city of Qom, roughly 95 kilometers southwest of Tehran, Fordo sits somewhere between 80 and 90 meters underground, which converts to roughly 260 to 300 feet of solid rock and reinforced concrete sitting directly on top of Iran's most hardened enrichment facility. Construction on the site is believed to have started around 2006, built specifically to survive conventional airstrikes, and it didn't become publicly acknowledged by Tehran until 2009, the same year it first became operational. It was designed from the ground up, quite literally, to be untouchable by any air power that existed at the time. And for years, that design worked exactly as intended. Israeli strikes earlier in this broader campaign had already managed to damage Iran's other major enrichment site at Natanz, but Israeli aircraft simply didn't carry munitions heavy enough or precise enough to meaningfully threaten a facility buried this deep. Fordo needed something entirely different, and as it turned out, only one country on Earth actually possessed the weapon capable of reaching it. That weapon is the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and the specs on this thing are genuinely staggering once you actually walk through them. It's a 30,000-pound bomb, roughly 20 feet long, 31.5 inches in diameter, carrying a warhead alone that weighs in at over 5,700 pounds. Built by Boeing in cooperation with the Air Force and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, this weapon was actually conceived and designed about 2 decades before it ever got used in actual combat, engineered from the very beginning with exactly this kind of scenario in mind, a deeply buried, heavily hardened target that conventional bunker busters simply couldn't reach. It's built to punch through more than 100 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating from inside the structure, collapsing it from within rather than just cratering the surface above it. And here's the detail that made this entire mission possible in the first place. The only aircraft in the American inventory actually capable of carrying and delivering this weapon is the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, and even the B-2 can only carry 2 of them at a time, given the sheer size and weight involved. Let's talk about the actual scale of what it took to get these weapons onto target, because this wasn't a quick strike package thrown together in an afternoon. This was described by the Defense Secretary at the time as a plan that took months and weeks of positioning and preparation, involving misdirection and what was described as the highest level of operational security the mission planners could achieve. In the week leading up to the actual strike, the United States quietly moved significant military assets into the Middle East theater, including an aircraft carrier strike group along with F-16s, F-22 Raptors, and F-35s from the Air Force, all positioned to support what was coming without tipping off Tehran about exactly what that support was actually for. And then came the deception operation itself, which honestly reads like something out of a military thriller rather than an actual real-world mission plan, complete with a decoy fleet, a silent bomber run, and a coordinated submarine strike timed to the minute. To preserve maximum surprise, at least 6 B-2 bombers were deliberately flown west toward the Pacific Ocean, heading in the direction of Guam, creating the very public impression that the United States was repositioning its stealth bomber fleet for a completely different kind of operation entirely. Meanwhile, 7 separate B-2s quietly launched in the opposite direction, heading east toward Iran, carrying the actual strike package that nobody outside a small circle of military planners knew was even happening. Given that the entire flyable B-2 inventory across the whole United States Air Force sits at only 20 aircraft total. This operation effectively committed into virtually the entire available fleet to a single mission, split between a decoy operation and the actual strike itself. The real strike package flew an 18-hour inbound mission from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, all the way to targets deep inside Iranian territory, maintaining minimal radio communications the entire way to preserve absolute secrecy. And remarkably, this entire mission was flown without requiring any forward operating base whatsoever, no stopover at Diego Garcia, no staging through any Middle Eastern airfield. Instead, the bombers refueled multiple times in midair from KC-135 and KC-46 tanker aircraft along the route, an extraordinary demonstration of genuine global reach capability that very few air forces on the planet could even attempt to replicate. Total flight time for the B-2 crews, factoring in the full round trip, stretched to approximately 36 to 37 hours in the air continuously. Each aircraft carried 2 pilots specifically so they could take turns resting in shifts, anywhere from 45 minutes to a full hour at a time, particularly during the more complex aerial refueling maneuvers when both pilots needed to be fully alert. The B-2's interior is actually equipped with a small toilet and reportedly even a microwave, features that sound almost mundane until you realize they're specifically what makes missions of this duration physically survivable for the crew locked inside a cockpit for over a day and a half straight. Some crews reportedly carried cases of energy drinks on board just to help stay sharp through the back half of the mission. So let's talk about the actual target list and how the strike package divided up the work, because this wasn't just about Fordo, even though Fordo was clearly the crown jewel of the entire operation. The main package concentrated its heaviest firepower on Fordo and on Natanz simultaneously. 6 of the 7 B-2s dropped a combined total of 12 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators directly onto Fordo, while the 7th B-2 struck Natanz at the same time with its own pair of MOPs. That's 14 bombs total, every single one of the operationally available massive ordnance penetrators in the American arsenal, expended in a single mission, marking the first ever operational combat use of this specific weapon anywhere in the world. This wasn't a demonstration or a limited test strike. This was the entire capability, committed all at once, against the single hardest target the United States had ever attempted to destroy with conventional munitions, and Fordo and Natanz weren't the only targets that night either. A third Iranian nuclear facility at Isfahan, a uranium conversion site rather than an enrichment facility, got hit by an entirely separate strike package, adding yet another dimension to an already extraordinarily complex multi-axis operation. More than 24 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, with some reports suggesting the number ran as high as 30, launched from a single Ohio-class guided missile submarine positioned somewhere in the regional waters, striking Isfahan at roughly 2:15 to 2:35 in the morning local time. That's a submarine. Hundreds of feet underwater, somewhere in the region, launching precision cruise missiles at a facility on the other side of the country, all coordinated to land at nearly the exact same moment the B-2s were releasing their bunker busters over Fordo and Natanz, so that Iranian air defense and command networks had to process 3 simultaneous, geographically separated attacks at once, rather than being able to concentrate their response on a single threat axis. None of that would have been possible without a substantial supporting cast of aircraft working to clear the path first. The strike package included F-22 Raptors from the 1st Fighter Wing providing air superiority coverage, along with F-35s adding their own stealth and sensor capability to the mix. F-16CJ Wild Weasel fighters, aircraft specifically built for the dangerous job of hunting and suppressing enemy air defenses, worked alongside EA-18G Growlers, the Navy's dedicated electronic warfare aircraft, to actively jam and confuse Iranian radar systems in the critical window before and during the strike. Anti-radiation missiles, specifically the AGM-88E Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile, got employed to physically destroy any Iranian radar installations that lit up and tried to track the incoming aircraft. And an EC-130H Compass Call aircraft added its own electronic attack capability into the mix, broadly disrupting Iranian communications and coordination across the target area during the critical strike window. In total, across every aircraft involved in the operation, more than 125 separate aircraft supported this mission in some capacity. And altogether, American forces employed approximately 75 precision-guided weapons across the entire strike package that night, including those 14 massive ordnance penetrators, the 2 to 3 dozen Tomahawks, and the various air-to-air and suppression munitions used by the Escort fighters to keep the bomber package safe throughout the entire operation. Now, here's where the story shifts from an extraordinary logistical and tactical achievement into something considerably more contested, because what actually happened underground at Fordo after those 12 bunker busters detonated became one of the most disputed intelligence questions of the entire conflict. In the immediate aftermath, the initial public claim from the administration was that the strikes had completely obliterated Iran's nuclear program, a word chosen specifically for its maximalist, unambiguous framing. But within days, a very different picture started leaking out through classified channels. According to a still classified assessment reportedly produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the bombs did not actually obliterate Fordo's enrichment site, the way that initial public claim suggested. Instead, according to that leaked assessment, the strike caused only limited damage to the advanced centrifuges housed inside the facility, a conclusion that, if accurate, would represent a genuinely significant gap between what was publicly claimed in the hours after the mission and what actually happened underground once the dust settled. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating from a pure physics and engineering standpoint, because independent analysts started doing the actual math themselves to figure out whether the bombs even had the physical capability to reach as deep as Fordow's enrichment halls actually sit. It's also worth understanding just how the Massive Ordnance Penetrator is actually engineered to achieve any penetration at all, because the physics involved are a lot more specific than just dropping something heavy from altitude. The MOP relies on kinetic energy accumulated during its fall, delivered through an extremely dense, high-strength steel casing designed specifically to survive the shock of impact without shattering or deforming before it has a chance to bury itself deep enough to detonate from within the target rather than on the surface. That's actually the entire design philosophy behind a penetrator weapon like this. The destructive power doesn't come primarily from the size of the explosion itself. It comes from where that explosion actually happens. A conventional bomb detonating on the surface above a deeply buried facility might crater the ground and collapse an entrance tunnel, but it does essentially nothing to equipment sitting 80 or 90 meters below. A penetrator weapon that manages to bury itself close to that depth before detonating channels its explosive force directly into the surrounding rock and structure at that depth, which is a fundamentally more effective way to damage deeply buried infrastructure, assuming the weapon actually reaches anywhere close to that target depth in the first place. That's exactly why the debate over penetration depth became such a central question in the aftermath, because the entire effectiveness of this specific weapon against this specific target hinges almost entirely on how close the bomb actually got to the enrichment halls before it went off, rather than simply on the raw size of the explosive charge itself. One widely circulated piece of open source analysis worked through the penetration physics using published performance coefficients for medium strength rock, the type of geology found in that specific mountain near Qom, and came up with a maximum penetration depth of roughly 7.9 meters, something in the neighborhood of 25 feet. Compare that to Fordow's actual depth, somewhere between 80 and 90 meters underground, and you start to see the scale of the potential gap between the bomb's physical capability and what would actually be required to directly destroy the deepest chambers of that facility. That's not a small discrepancy. That's the difference between a weapon reaching a target and a weapon falling dramatically short of it, at least according to that specific independent calculation. The administration, for its part, disputed the reporting around that DIA assessment fairly directly, though notably shifted its own language somewhat over the following days and weeks. Officials acknowledged that the underlying intelligence picture remained genuinely inconclusive in certain respects, which is a meaningfully different claim than the initial obliteration language used in the immediate aftermath of the strike. It's worth spending a moment on exactly why battle damage assessment for a target like this is so genuinely difficult to nail down, because it's not simply a matter of institutional spin or political messaging on either side of the debate. When a conventional bomb hits an above-ground target, damage assessment analysts can often rely on straightforward before and after satellite imagery, comparing the physical footprint of a building or facility before the strike to what remains afterward. That approach works reasonably well for surface targets. It works dramatically less well for something like Fordo, where the actual object of interest, the centrifuge cascades and enrichment equipment, sits nearly 90 meters below anything a satellite can actually see. Analysts instead have to work from indirect indicators. Seismic sensors positioned around the region can detect the shockwave signature of an underground detonation and estimate roughly how much explosive energy was released and how deep that energy was released at. But that kind of seismic analysis carries meaningful margins of error, especially when you're trying to distinguish between a detonation that occurred at 70 meters depth versus one that occurred at 25 meters depth. A difference that matters enormously for whether the actual enrichment halls got directly hit or whether the explosion happened well short of them in the surrounding rock layer instead. And there's a real, defensible reason why the intelligence picture might actually be murky here rather than simply being spin in either direction. Assessing bomb damage on a facility buried nearly 90 meters underground is an extraordinarily difficult intelligence problem under the best of circumstances, since you can't just fly a drone overhead and visually confirm what happened to equipment sitting deep inside a mountain. Analysts have to rely on a combination of seismic data from the detonations themselves, satellite imagery of the surface entrances, and any subsequent Iranian activity around the site, and whatever signals intelligence might be available, none of which gives you the kind of clean, unambiguous confirmation you'd get from simply looking at a crater on open ground. And that ambiguity gets compounded by something else entirely, which is what Iran itself was doing in the days immediately before the strike actually happened. Satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies, a commercial satellite imagery company, captured a row of trucks at the Fordo site in the days leading up to the American strike, imagery that prompted widespread speculation about exactly what those vehicles were doing there. Iranian state television subsequently claimed that nuclear material had actually been removed from all three targeted facilities. Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan before the American strikes ever took place. Independent analysis of that satellite imagery suggested those trucks may have been present specifically to help seal off tunnel entrances with dirt and covering material, a defensive measure that would help shield the facility's interior from a potential ground assault rather than necessarily indicating a full evacuation of nuclear material. But the possibility that Iran managed to relocate at least some of its enriched uranium stockpile and sensitive equipment before the bombs ever fell remains a real, unresolved question that analysts have continued debating for months since. Let's talk about what Iran actually retained, even if we take the most conservative reading of how effective the strikes turned out to be, because this matters enormously for understanding the actual strategic picture, rather than just the dramatic headline of the mission itself. Assessments following the strike suggested Iran likely retained something in the neighborhood of 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, along with the underlying technical ability to manufacture additional centrifuges and potentially one or possibly even two additional underground enrichment sites beyond the 3 primary facilities that were actually targeted that night. That's a genuinely important detail, because it means even in a scenario where Operation Midnight Hammer achieved everything it was designed to achieve against Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan specifically, it likely didn't represent the complete and total elimination of Iran's nuclear program in its entirety, since meaningful stockpiles and technical capability appear to have survived the strike in some form. And it's worth putting the sheer expenditure of that mission in perspective one more time, because 14 massive ordnance penetrators wasn't a subset of some larger available stockpile held in reserve somewhere. That number represented essentially the entire operationally available inventory of this specific weapon that the United States possessed at the time, a weapon that had taken roughly 2 decades to design, test, and produce in the first place, and that cannot simply be manufactured again on short notice if circumstances demanded a second strike of similar scale sometime down the road. That's an important detail for understanding just how much this single mission represented a genuine one-time commitment of an extraordinarily rare and difficult-to-replace capability, rather than simply one strike drawn from an easily replenished stockpile the way conventional munitions typically work. Whatever assessment eventually proves correct about how much actual damage those 14 bombs inflicted on Fordo and Natanz, the United States effectively spent its entire available supply of the one weapon on Earth built specifically for this exact mission, all in a single night. Now let's do the actual strategic analysis here, because there's a lot to unpack about why this single mission ended up being so consequential for everything that followed. On one level, Operation Midnight Hammer represented an almost unprecedented demonstration of American military reach and precision. A mission that flew from the middle of the continental United States to a heavily defended target deep inside Iranian territory, dropped the entire available inventory of the most powerful conventional bunker buster ever built, and returned every single aircraft safely without a single loss, all while maintaining enough operational secrecy that the deception operation toward Guam apparently worked well enough to help preserve genuine surprise. From a pure execution standpoint, that's about as close to a flawless, high-risk, high-complexity military operation as you'll find in recent history. 7 B-2s, 18 hours each way, 0 aircraft lost, target struck exactly on schedule alongside a coordinated submarine, launched cruise missile strike hundreds of miles away, hitting at almost the identical moment. But on another level, the disputed damage assessment afterward reveals something important about the actual limits of even the most advanced conventional weaponry when it comes up against a target specifically engineered over the better part of 2 decades to survive exactly this kind of attack. Fordo wasn't some improvised facility that happened to end up underground. It was purpose-built from the ground up, starting back in 2006, specifically with the assumption that someday it might need to survive precisely this scenario, an American or Israeli strike using the best conventional bunker-busting technology available. And the fact that there's a genuine, still unresolved debate among intelligence analysts about how much actual damage those bombs managed to inflict tells you that even a purpose-built 30,000-pound weapon, delivered with textbook precision by the only aircraft in the world capable of carrying it, still might not have been enough to completely guarantee total destruction of a target, engineered with that level of foresight and that much depth of rock and concrete, standing between the surface and the actual enrichment halls underneath. This is really the core tension that's defined the entire nuclear dimension of this broader conflict ever since that night. Was Fordo effectively taken off the table as a functioning enrichment site, with its underground halls collapsed and its centrifuge cascades destroyed beyond any near-term repair? Or did enough of the facility, and enough of Iran's stockpile actually survive, that the strike represents a serious but ultimately temporary setback, rather than the kind of permanent program-ending blow the initial public claims suggested? The honest answer, based on everything that's actually been made public, sits somewhere in between those two extremes And reasonable analysts, looking at the exact same satellite imagery, the exact same physics calculations, and the exact same classified leaks, have reached genuinely different conclusions about where on that spectrum the truth actually lands. What's not in dispute, regardless of how you read the underground damage assessment, is what this mission represented as a statement of capability and intent. For years, Fordo had been treated by military planners and nuclear proliferation experts alike as essentially untouchable. A facility so deep, so hardened, so deliberately over-engineered against exactly this kind of threat that conventional airstrikes were widely assumed to be fundamentally incapable of reaching it. Operation Midnight Hammer proved that assumption wrong, at least in the sense that the United States demonstrated it could physically deliver the necessary ordnance onto that exact target, using the only weapon on the planet built specifically for that job, flown by the only aircraft capable of carrying it, across nearly 40 hours of continuous flight time without losing a single airframe in the process.